Stardom podcast. I'm your host, Josh Shepardson, and you can follow me on Twitter where I post as at VChat50. And week 8 is upon us, and it's time to determine which guys need to be in your lineups and which guys need to be glued to your benches due to matchups, due to recent play, due to a number of variables. And the first player that I'm going to advocate sitting this week is quarterback Russell Wilson. He's at Dallas. Many people drafted him with the hopes that he'd be like a top 5, top 10 quarterback at the worst. The fact that he can use his legs, he can beat you with his arm, the addition of Jimmy Graham had a lot of people hyped up with the expectation that he would make a leap forward. Jimmy Graham hasn't really emerged as a big weapon for Russell Wilson yet. He does have one big game on his slate, but has not been reliable. And Russell Wilson's pretty much doing what Russell Wilson's done through the vast majority of his career, not lighting up the air with just 238.3 yards passing per game, is adding some value on the ground, but he's well off of his pace for rushing yards last year, has 271 so far this year, has yet to find pay dirt, so not adding enough value with his legs either. And I think last week we saw the formula that the Seahawks are going to get back to, and that's a healthy Marshawn Lynch getting the ball 20-plus times and then playing good defense. And this week they're facing backup quarterback Matt Castle with the Cowboys. So you expect the defense to deliver on their end. Odds makers expect the Seahawks to win by around a touchdown. And that means that if the game flow goes as expected by the odds makers, there's little reason for Russell Wilson to air it out a ton. Cowboys haven't been super giving to quarterbacks. They haven't exactly been a nightmare defense to face, but Wilson's not getting enough volume. He's not doing enough with his legs. He's not finding pay dirt. He's not doing enough with his arm. And I don't love the matchup, and I don't love the usage. And I think, like I said, last week, I think is a pretty good indicator of what the Seahawks would like to do. I think there are 12 better quarterbacks to use this week than Russell Wilson, and that means he needs to be glued to your benches. Excuse me. Looking at the same game, let's look at the running back that needs to be glued to your bench, and it's the waiver wire darling of the week, and that's Darren McFadden. He went nuts last week, rushing for 152 yards and 29 carries. He's been announced as the starter for this week, but he's facing a really tough, really stingy Seattle Seahawks defense. They're not allowing a lot of fantasy points to opposing running backs. In fact, they've allowed the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And this is Darren McFadden we're talking about still. I've been a firm believer and a drafter of him year in and year out, but really he only has one big season on his resume. Last week's performance is in stark contrast to the rest of the season. I do think he's a very good waiver wire addition, so if you did grab him, good move, but there's no need to get your shiny new toy in your lineup this week. The matchup is bad. You can do better at flex at RB2. He does not fit as a starter this week. Even with volume, I question what kind of actual production he can put up. So, and that's assuming he gets a great deal of volume. And it's also possible that they go to a hot hand at running back as well, and maybe that's Christine Michael this week. So they've gone committee this year. I do think that McFadden has the best chance to continue to maintain a feature back workload as he did last week, but 1 week doesn't a season make, let's say. So I'd like to see a little bit more of it, and this is a bad matchup anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and advocate keeping him glued to your bench. Another player that should be glued to your bench, and this really should go without saying, but I think it's a good opportunity to remind people that don't get married to your draft position. We're almost halfway through the season, so I don't care what draft pick you spend on a player. You don't just start them blindly. And Davante Adams draws a tough matchup with Denver Broncos. Their secondary is absolutely loaded. Whether he's facing Aqib Talib or Corey Harris Jr., he's not going to get a soft corner covering him. And that means that it's going to be a long day for him. And Adams really wasn't doing much in the 2 games before he was hurt. So I can't in good faith even think of a situation to advocate using Adams in. He needs to be glued to your bench. In fact, I'm not sure he's a must-start in great matchups at this point. James Jones is the number 2 in Green Bay behind Randall Cobb. He's cemented himself in that spot. And Ty Montgomery's looked good at times as a number 3. So If anything this weekend, you should be keeping tabs on his snap count for Davante Adams, because he may be a regular on your bench or going to the wire if he doesn't play enough this week. But this matchup, not a good one. The Broncos have just been locking everybody up at receiver. So go ahead and keep Adams glued to your bench. Yeah, it's great that he's returning from injury. It does give Aaron Rodgers another weapon to throw to. Not that Rodgers' starting status is ever in question. You start him against everyone every week. But Davante Adams is not a guy that you want in your lineups this week. The final sit-'em option that I'm going to bring up today is Eric Ebron. And Ebron's played very well in year 2. He has missed time due to injury, but he had a strong showing in week 7. Unfortunately, he draws one of the toughest defenses against tight ends this year. In fact, he draws the toughest defense in terms of points, fantasy points per game allowed to tight ends this year in the Kansas City Chiefs. Chiefs have been gashed through the air, but that's by receivers. So don't be fooled by the very giving numbers. Don't be fooled by their opponent's defensive ranking of 24 in the table here in the article. They have been giving to opposing passers, and they've also been giving to opposing receivers, but tight ends have had a tough go of it against them. Games in London. There's a new offensive coordinator running the show in Detroit, and we don't know how Jim Bob Cooter's going to utilize his weapons in the passing game. Plenty of questions around Ebron, and the tough matchup make him a sit. I do think this is going to be a big week for Calvin Johnson. I do think you might see Golden Tate have a good showing as well, and it really comes down to matchup, and the Chiefs have not defended receivers well. So if Jim Bob Cooter wants to get an A on the assignment of first game as offensive coordinator, then he'd be wise to implement a game plan that utilizes his receivers heavily, and unfortunately that's going to be at Eric Ebron's expense. Moving on to the guys that you should have in your lineups, let's first look at Matt Ryan. Now, obviously, coming into the season, he was drafted as a starter. It's no-duh selection, you could say, at starting quarterback, but the emergence of Devonta Freeman has lessened the burden on Matt Ryan. He doesn't have a great touchdown to interception ratio this year. He is passing for a lot of yardage, but and some other guys have emerged. So I wouldn't say that week in and week out Matt Ryan is a slam dunk start, but this week he is a slam dunk start. He's facing a Bucs defense that can be beaten through the air. Ryan is passing for yardage at a high clip this year, so that helps as well. And one nugget that I really found interesting and that I like, that I think basically cements Ryan's status as not only a starter but a guy who could perform like a top 5 quarterback this week, is the fact that the Bucs rank dead last in Football Outsiders in defending #1 receivers. And Julio Jones is arguably the best #1 receiver in the league, and Matt Ryan throws to him like it. Julio Jones is one of the most targeted receivers in the league, and Matt Ryan finds a way to get him the football. This is going to be no exception this week, and it's going to be no exception against a defense that should make it very easy to connect with Julio Jones. So I love Matt Ryan this week. He needs to be in your lineups. Next up is Ronnie Hillman at running back, and the coaches are saying what you want to hear if you're a Ronnie Hillman owner. C.J. Anderson might start, but don't view the starting status for Anderson as meaning that he's going to get the bulk of the snaps. In fact, on the contrary, Hillman should be playing more, is expected to get a heavier workload. He's been the far more productive back, had 2 100-yard rushing efforts, 100-plus yard rushing efforts in his last 3 games. Does add a little bit of value through the air. Not so much this year, but he has at least demonstrated some capable pass-catching skills in the past. And he's ripping off 4.9 yards per carry and facing a Green Bay defense that has a lot of touchdowns, and that's why they are not giving up a ton of fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but they are getting gashed for 4.7 yards per carry. So they are exploitable, and if the Broncos are smart and they want to keep this close, and they want to try and win a game that the Packers are slight favorites in Denver, then they would be wise to rely on their defense and give the ball to Ronnie Hillman. The matchup is good, and I think that they're wisely going to come out at the break doing that. Peyton Manning has not looked like Peyton Manning, so expect them to lean on the running game a little bit more than they have in years past. And Ronnie Hillman looks like a slam dunk start to me. Definitely a strong flex, and even a viable RB2, I believe. Next up is a guy who had a big week in Week 7. and a guy who's going to be relied upon heavily in the absence of Arian Foster in the running game, and that's wide receiver Nate Washington. If you want to go down narrative street, so to speak, he is facing his former employer, the Tennessee Titans, but I'm not concerned with that. What I am concerned with, or pleased with, I should say, is the fact that he's getting plenty of targets and has gotten plenty of targets playing in games with Arian Foster as the starting running back. Foster's out for the year now, and that's going to place a heavier burden on Brian Hoyer in the passing attack. Cecil Shorts III may return this week, which is another mouth for Hoyer to feed. DeAndre Hopkins, the unquestioned one, but Nate Washington's still going to get plenty of targets. I'd expect between 8 and 10 targets this week, as I wrote in the article. And 8 to 10 targets is plenty for him to get some viable fantasy work in. I expect him to match or exceed his 67.4 yards receiving per game total. And he is a home run threat. He does have the ability to get behind defenses and stretch the field. So I like Nate Washington quite a bit this week. I think he's a solid wide receiver 3 or a very good flex option. And the final player we're going to talk about was a guy that was in this article last week in the sit-em section of things, and that's tight end Benjamin Watson, who I'm advocating starting this week. And really it all comes down to matchup. Ben Watson faces the Giants this week, and the Giants are one of the most giving defenses to opposing tight ends. Watson is a big target in the red zone for Drew Brees, and even though his Week 6 showing against the Falcons on Thursday Night Football is an outlier, it's an aberration, let's call it what it is, his Week 7 showing is more in line with what is a reasonable expectation for the tight end. Drew Brees does like using his tight ends, and Ben Watson has been the tight end of choice for him this year. And last week he caught 4 of his 5 targets, total 59 yards. I think that's very much within reach. And against the Giants, a giving defense like they are, there's that potential for a red zone target as well and maybe a touchdown. So if you're getting 4 receptions for 59 yards and a touchdown, you're taking it at your tight end position. Even if you only get a repeat of last week's performance, 4 for around 60. PPR leagues, you'll take double-digit points. You'll take your 10 points at tight end if you're in a position where you're considering Benjamin Watson anyway. So unless you're an owner that's got guys like Greg Olsen or Tyler Eifert, where Ben Watson isn't going to come and play anyway, Watson looks pretty good in that fringe starter tier, and the matchup is right this week. So with that, I hope you are listening carefully, making your roster adjustments accordingly, and good luck this week. Check back next week, and in the meantime, check out fantasyfootballcafe.com, where we have some great articles up, and the forums are as active as ever. So get in there, get chatting, and have some fun. Take care.